Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar on educational standards. We hope that today's presentation will help you wield the power of BISG's new Educational Taxonomy to sell into the educational market. I'm Zelina Alvey, the Community Manager here at BookNet Canada, and our host for today is Patricia Payton, the Senior Manager of Publisher Relations and Content Development for Bowker, a ProQuest affiliate. She's responsible for communicating book and journal metadata requirements and best practices to publishers of all sizes, and she has experience in retail bookstores as well as international markets. She holds a master's degree in library information science, specializing in digital libraries, as well as an MBA, and she actively contributes to BISG, AAP, and other industry committees.
Welcome to this webinar on the BNC Educational Standards. I'm going to take you through a very short agenda. We're going to talk about the new BISG Educational Taxonomy, the benefits of that taxonomy, and then look at some educational metadata in action. Let's get started understanding the new taxonomy and how it was developed. So the BISG working group, and the BISG stands for Book Industry Study Group, if you're not familiar, and that's our group in the U.S. It also covers Canada, where we look at standards and looking at making things flow easier within the supply chain. So the BISG working group for the Educational Taxonomy evaluated whether educational objectives should be a controlled set of terms or recommendations for keywords. So we took this project and we said, how can we better communicate educational objectives to the readers of the books? So what can the publishers do? What can others in the supply chain do to make it easier for people to communicate these educational objectives? And so the group decided on a taxonomy because they felt it would provide a standard set of key terms and phrases. So you wouldn't necessarily come up with one term and I come up with another term. We would all be talking to educators and readers with the same language. So that common language, then we can bridge subject matter and we can bridge grade levels. And we didn't want to attach ourselves to, say, the Common Core state standards or any other state standards because we wanted it to be international in scope, and we wanted it to be across those objectives no matter what developed over time, as opposed to being tied directly to a program of standards that may not be in existence in 5 years from now. And we wanted this taxonomy to complement other things that we have in metadata, so other educational metadata points, like BISAC subject headings, like age and grade information, reading levels. So the work of this BISG working group was to come up with a language, and we came up with a taxonomy. The objectives of our work for this working group were to facilitate the easy communication of key learning objectives. So we didn't try to tackle thousands of learning objectives. We actually tackled about 100 learning objectives. So we kept our educational taxonomy narrow. We wanted to allow consumers to more easily discover titles meeting their needs. Now, those consumers may be parents, they may be teachers, they may be librarians, helping to facilitate teachers and students within their school. So we wanted to narrow down false hits and find a highly relevant match rate. Then we wanted to describe that publication's intended learning outcomes. So we wanted to make sure that we didn't necessarily align with a standard or a set of standards, but that we really communicate to the consumer what this book will help them teach, or what are the objectives within this book. And I'll talk more about this when we see the actual taxonomy. You'll get an idea of what these learning objectives are. So to give you an idea of the design of the taxonomy, we use a code, and the code of each one of these starts with EDTX, which is just Educational Taxonomy, and then there's 3 numbers. So this term 010 translates to the description analyze and interpret data. And this descriptor is, we feel from the working group, a learning objective that many educators of many grade levels and age levels would want to tackle in their classroom. So by applying this element of EDTX010 to a title, you are applying the concept analyze and interpret metadata, and implying that this book, whether it be fiction, in other cases it may be fiction, it may be nonfiction, that you could use this book to teach this concept, okay? And we'll get more examples here. So this is a sample list of the 100 terms. And notice that all of them include action words at the beginning. And then it also has additional information that helps describe the learning objective. So if you were to look at a particular state standard, or you were to look at like next generation science standards, you might see some of this terminology, but it may be that the term used in that standard is much longer than this. We tried to shorten the phrase so that we could make them common across different standards and easier for people to search with. So what we did was we looked at the Common Core State Standards, the Next Generation Science Standards, the 21st Century Skills, and we looked at several U.S. state standards where those states had glossaries of learning objectives that we could reference. And from this, the working group identified a long list of terminology from all of these resources, and then we had compared it across subject areas. So we had an English language arts group that identified their terms. We had science, we had social studies, and we had math. And each group identified their long list of terms. From there, we shortened the phrases and we combined them across the various subject areas. And then we went and we validated the terminology in search engines. And we looked at the verbs, and we wanted to make sure that we were referencing and grouping like standards together, like learning objectives together. So we went to a lot of research to come up with these terms. So we feel that we're fairly certain that we hit on the most popular terms. We didn't try to say, okay, well, build vocabulary through first-person narratives, but build vocabulary is the term we maybe took that concept down to. And you might build vocabulary in science, you might build vocabulary in geometry, and you might build vocabulary in English language arts. So that gives you an idea of how we came up with these terms. The complete list of terms can be found at this first link, which is the BISG website. And when you click through, you'll get a document that has all of the 100 EDTX codes and their descriptors in it. Then we also, in this working group, conducted a couple of rounds of surveys with educators, and we did a survey with publishers and other people in the book-selling marketplace. And we are fairly certain that with what we did with all of this background and the surveys, that this will be welcomed in the industry and it'll be adopted and used. And we hope that you coming to this webinar today will consider adopting and using this within your metadata. For the second survey with the educators and librarians, we had over 1,000 respondents, and they highly endorsed this type of metadata. So we hope that you can look at those results if you want to in this link, the recommendations for citing educational standards and objectives and metadata. And you could look for and see for yourself, hey, yes, this does tell us valid information of what the marketplace wants. So if you want to sell this to your upper management and they say, well, why do we need to do this? Hopefully there's some information in there that will help you sell this practice on up within your organization. So let's talk about some of those benefits for this taxonomy. I'm going to start with an example of a Common Core state standard, which I know isn't really relevant in Canada, but I want you to get the idea that there's phrases like this: identify basic similarities in and differences between two texts on the same topic, e.g. in illustrations, descriptions, or procedures. So even though Canada doesn't have the Common Core, you have learning objectives stated like this in every one of your state or national standards. So the metadata that we have available in ONIX today will give us some information on this learning objective as an example. So our metadata will tell us fiction versus nonfiction. We do that through BISAC code today. Our metadata will tell us, oh, there are illustrations in this book. They're black and white, they're color, how many illustrations there are. And the metadata will allow us to send a table of contents, which will indicate the level of detail on a topic. So it'll say, well, there are actually 10 pages on this one specific topic of geometry, or the whole book is on this specific topic of geometry. So the consumer can look at those metadata elements and determine if that book meets that educational objective. But there's one more thing. Keywords or subject codes. You can get a time period, you can get a setting in those. There's also regional codes for BISACs, which I included as subject codes, so for setting. So what you can't get in the metadata is you can't understand whether the events in the book are chronological or not. You cannot understand themes within the text unless someone has named those either in the description of the book or someone has put those themes in keywords within the metadata. And also, you can't tell the sophistication of the graphics. Are the graphics computer generated? Are they photographs? Are they historical photographs? Are they modern photographs? We don't describe that well in ONIX. Now here's another learning objective to show you more points. So this one is identify who's telling the story at various points in the text. So from that, you'd want to know what was the author's perspective, what are the characters' perspectives, and even what is the cultural perspective of the character who's telling the story if it's a first-person story. So these are not points that are easily described in ONIX today, and so that's where we started with there needs to be something else to help us communicate to readers and to consumers these learning objectives, because we know we're missing some things in ONIX. I want to give you some further examples. So in searching for books relevant to educational objectives, here I have put in the search term read informational text, which is one of our taxonomy skills or learning objectives. But when I put that in and I run the search, I basically come up with books that are teaching the concept. And you can see here, there's 6 results. So there's not many results, and it's all geared towards teaching. It's not geared towards the reader learning the concept, the student learning the concept. Now, I did another search term, compare and contrast, and there I get more results. So I got 27 results this time, but mostly it's because the words are used in the subtitle field or in the title field or in the description field. So I could get many more results, and I could do a more robust search if I was able to search for compare and contrast in a standard part of the metadata. So this is what the educational taxonomy will do. As a user searches, they may search for a subject area like hockey, and then maybe they put in 2 learning objectives, compare and contrast, and use listening skills. Although it would work just as well with 1 learning objective, but here I put 2. And what they want to get are relevant texts for their classroom and for individual reading activities. And it's going to be, in this case, a cross-reference between the BISAC subject code and these learning objectives. So on the left, we have fictional titles, and on the right, we have nonfiction titles. And all of these titles could potentially be used for these two learning objectives. So that's the goal of using the educational taxonomy, is to produce more relevant results for the educators and for the parents trying to find books on these topics. Here's another example. So here we're looking at search terms that are first-person narrative. I want to search for grades 9 to 10, and the subject is prejudice and racism. Here's what the metadata would look like on these books. So they'd have EDTX 600, grade level 9 and 10, and then the juvenile code, meaning prejudice and racism. And here's a couple of the search results that would come up. So the search was truly narrowed by the 3 levels of metadata, as opposed to just having one of those 3 individually, where you pull up many more items on prejudice or racism, or many more books for grades levels 9 and 10. But here, you're pulling up first-person narratives with those other pieces of metadata. So now, you might be thinking, well, this taxonomy is just a string of keywords. So why couldn't we just put in the keywords, compare and contrast? Well, we wanted to make it more standard. And by using a taxonomy, you're going to get fewer results. You're going to get a higher match to relevant titles. We want to try to kind of eliminate the various versions of a phrase that people might key in. So you could put in many more words to describe compare and contrast. You could just put in compare. You could put in contrast. We want it to be standard when you pull up these results. And we wanted these terms to apply to many curriculum standards, not just isolated to Common Core, which is very popular. It's a very popular term in the U.S. right now. We want them to be consistent among trading partners, so we want all publishers to use the same terminology and not for each one to come up with their own variation of those learning objectives. And we wanted to kind of endorse this as an industry so that we would allow for greater discoverability across search engines by using a standard term throughout our metadata. So who is going to benefit from this? Well, the working group felt that every party in the supply chain could benefit from this. And we put in there specific bullets in our recommendations document that you could, as I said before, use for upper management to help sell this idea. So for book selling, we feel that this is going to aid the marketing, the discoverability, the merchandising of book sellings and reaching consumers. For content creators, we think it may help publishing workflow. If you put these tags in your content management systems, it will help you identify audiences later on. You can put these terms within EPUB if you put your ONIX information within your EPUB. We hope that it can be used in MARC records as well as schema.org so that you could put it behind the scenes on your own website for the search engines to find. We want this to help retailers, publisher websites, wholesaler ordering systems, anywhere that books are sold. We feel that the educational taxonomy would help you add a layer of discovery to those products. And we feel that schools and libraries could use it within their library systems. They could use it within school library collections. So a wholesaler selling into school libraries could feature compare and contrast titles for 3rd grade. And we hope that the leveling scheme people will also adopt this. So we've been in conversation with Fontes and Pinnell and Renaissance Learning and Lexile, and we've told them about the educational taxonomy, and we hope that they will embrace it as well within their metadata records in their system. So that gives you an idea about the benefits. So now let's take a look at educational metadata and how it can be sent in ONIX. So I'm going to give you examples of ONIX 3. You can express all these ideas in ONIX 2.1. It may be that they use different tags, and I'm going to go beyond the taxonomy here. So we'll start by looking at the taxonomy, but then we'll look at the other areas of the subject composite and what you could do with those. We'll look at the other text composite. we'll look at audience, and we'll look at text complexity. First, this is how you would send the educational taxonomy. It's part of the subject composite. So you open with your subject tag and you close with your subject tag. And then B1 is the code that indicates down here, I've got the educational taxonomy, and you're using the short term, but when your data recipient gets the metadata, they can explode out that code to be analyzed and interpret data on their website. Now let's look at BISAC subjects. The best practices indicate you should send 1 to 3 codes, and you should avoid general codes, and those are the ones that end in a lot of zeros. And this is an example of how you would send just this last BISAC code in ONIX. Your scheme, instead of B1, as it was for the educational taxonomy, is 10. So that's how easy it is to switch from educational taxonomy to BISACs. You're probably already sending BISACs today, and it's just inserting another code and one of those 100 terms in order to change what you're sending as a BISAC into the educational taxonomy. Now, in the working group, a year ago, we had a working group on Common Core, which talked about how we could send Common Core state standards in ONIX, and from there, we developed the way to send them in ONIX. So again, it's a subject classification. A4 is the code, and then you would send the complete abbreviated Common Core citation. And this one's taken from this ORCA Publishers Group Teacher's Guide. And so they already have that metadata. They just may not have it on their website, but they could quite easily then translate it from the teaching guides into ONIX. And I want to reinforce here that Common Core as a label should not just be sent on your title. So anybody can put a sticker on the book. Anybody can put a line in their descriptive copy that says Common Core, relevant to the Common Core, great for the Common Core. But to the readers, that doesn't mean anything. And just to stress this point, I just want to tell you a little anecdote. We had a back-to-school night at my daughter's school a week ago. So it was a chance for us to meet the teachers, to look at the new textbooks, and the principal announced at the beginning of back-to-school night, we're proud to have a new reading criteria, curriculum for the K-3 age groups, and don't be alarmed, it says Common Core on the front of the book. So the principal's saying Common Core doesn't mean anything. And she proceeded to say, just because it says Common Core, we don't have to follow the Common Core, and it's just a label. Everybody puts it on their textbook these days. So that just reinforces that not only does the marketplace not want it, but now the marketplace is pretty much discounting it. So by sending the actual scheme detail, you're probably better off than just sending a Common Core label somewhere in your metadata. The next point is keywords, and these also are sent in the subject scheme identifier code as code 20. And you can just pull them off of your website or out of your database, put a delimiter between them, and send them in your ONIX as well. So those are the 4 areas that you can send in the subject composite. Now we're going to move on to audience. Now here we see interest, age, and grade levels. I want you to be specific about those, so don't just send one, because it was adamant in our group from people who deal with students that a grade level is not necessarily the same as an interest level. You might have advanced readers, you might have slow readers, so really both pieces of information are needed. And this is just an example of how you would send the interest age in the audience range composite. You would use this identifier 17 to indicate that you're sending interest age. You'd use a 26 for Canadian school grade range, 11 for US grade range, and 18 for reading age, which would be the K6 to 12 here would be your reading age. The next element is leveling information. And when we did the initial survey for the educational taxonomy, the top 3 things that educators said they need when they're searching for metadata were subject, leveling information, and learning objectives. So you can send your learning objectives in ONIX in the complexity composites. Now this one, Fontes and Pinnell, would get an 05 as the code along with the level. And then Lexile would be 06 up here, Frye readability score would be 03, and ATOS for books would be 07. Tables of contents can be sent as part of the text content composite. So in ONIX 3, it's called the text content. In ONIX 2.1, it was called the other text composite. So this information allows the educator to see just how much material in the book is relevant to a specific learning objective, and you can send the whole thing. Again, you would just put a delimiter between each row of data. So here I put a semicolon between each row in the table of contents. I want to also point out this website had index included, yes, but you can actually send your index in the same way as you send a table of contents with the text type 15, and instead of just putting a yes or no indicator, you would just put the whole index from your book in between those text tags. You can also, in the text content composite, if you want to send a description specifically for teachers, you could send an 05 tag. And if you want to send a description specifically for students, you can send an 06 tag. And that way, you could have a different description meant for different audiences for your book. And finally, I want to reinforce that all of your formats of the same book should have the same metadata. So repeat your table of contents, your index, your subject classifications, your educational taxonomy on the hardback, the paperback, on the ebook, on the series, so that you can maximize your sales across all formats.
Thank you to everyone for joining us, and especially thank you to Patricia for taking the time to walk us through all of this, and for an amazing presentation. Thanks very much. Any final words, Pat?
Well, I thank everybody for coming today, and if you have any questions, feel free to contact me.